Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Star Technology. For those who didn't watch the last episode, we mostly just messed with mystical agriculture, set up some nether stars, and even got some assembly lines set up. Between episodes, we upgraded our steam turbines further, and we also ended up moving our rock filtrators and void extractors up here to the ore processing floor, just to finish clearing the rest of the machines out of the area where the old base was. On to today's projects though. I started off the day by doubling the amount of assembly lines we have and hooking them all up to data banks. We're at 12 assembly lines now, but the idea is that each block here will have its own data bank and cables running through the ceiling to a main bank that actually holds all of our data for us. Because fiber optic cables can't split off multiple directions, we're forced to nest our data banks in order to avoid making multiple copies of all of our research data. For now, we're using an IV scanner to do research for us, but today the main goal is to upgrade to a research station so we can research more advanced technology. The casings for these aren't very expensive, so I already built the frame for it, but the controller is a whole mission of itself here because it will require us to set up Nequada fission reactors, and fusion reactors just to craft it. We'll need NAC before we can even set up fusion reactors, and it's a bit slow at first, so I think it's a good idea to start with that. To be honest, I feel like NAC is easier than Platinum Line, mostly because it's just a bunch of EBFs with maybe 3 other machines to get it going. I feel like at this point in progression, if you're playing along with me, you should be able to handle this line for yourself, but I'll go through it as long as you promise not to get upset with me for saying Nequada, sulfur, or looping too much. Deal? Cool, let's get into it. I tried to find a flow chart for this line for those of you that like charts, but unfortunately the only ones I could find were missing steps for some reason, and I didn't want to add an incorrect chart for my video. We'll just have to do without. Anyways, before we start the line, we'll need a couple materials. First, just make sure that you have Nequada dust being generated. I set up Nequada generation yesterday with a dimensional destabilizer, so if you don't have one of those, you'll need to set one up before you can do this. The other materials we'll need though are sulfuric acid and fluoroantimonic acid, and 1,000 buckets or so of each of these should be fine. You can make your Nequada line as big as you would like, just keep in mind that Nequada generation uses nether stars, so make sure nether stars are set up well enough to keep up with it. On top of that, the bottleneck for this line is pretty much always EBFs for NAC line, and those use a lot of power, so it's just about how much energy you're willing to dump into the setup. My personal opinion is that this line is only really temporary until we get chem plants on the next tier, so there's no reason to go super crazy with it. To start our chemical processing, we take our Nequada dust and fluoroantimonic acid, and we put them in an LCR for impure enriched Nequada solution, impure Nequadria solution, and titanium trifluoride. The titanium trifluoride from this does its normal looping process with hydrogen for titanium ingots and hydrofluoric acid, which just gets electrolyzed for our hydrogen and fluorine back. To process our impure solutions from that LCR step though, the next step is to centrifuge both of these into their respective outputs. The antimony trifluoride from these will loop back around for more fluoroantimonic acid, but focusing on the outputs from the impure enriched Nequada solution, we'll also get tritium sulfide and enriched NAC solution. We'll get back to the solution in a second, but to get tritium ingots out of our tritium sulfide, we need to cook it in an EBF with zinc, which will also give us zinc sulfide. The zinc sulfide is just another dust we can electrolyze to loop the zinc and sulfur, but with tritium taken care of, let's backtrack to the impure Nequadria solution. In addition to the antimony trifluoride I mentioned earlier, centrifuging this will give us Nequadria solution and indium phosphate. I usually just show the indium phosphate to my main net and autocraft my indium from there, but as for the Nequadria solution, we take that and the enriched Nequada solution from earlier and throw them both in a mixer with sulfuric acid for the acidic variants of these solutions. From here, the next step is to centrifuge the acidic solutions again to get fluorine, NAC wastes, Nequadria sulfate, and enrich Nequata sulfate. We can send the waste to a distillation tower for some sulfuric acid and solutions back, along with some other dust you can electrolyze for more sulfur. Returning our focus to the sulfate dust from the last step though, we need to send them to EBFs with hydrogen for ingots and more sulfuric acid. We'll need to use some of our trinium from the other steps in order to make the coils to cook our nequadria sulfate, but to be honest, I usually just ignore the enriched nequata sulfate entirely because we already get it in an abundance from ore processing. This will throw off our looping for sulfuric acid, so to remedy this, I decided the best option was just to passively produce it as fast as I possibly could with one LCR. By the grace of Greg, perfect overclocking with subticks will solve all of our chemical problems. Anyways, whether you cook the enriched nequata from this or not, just finish off your nequata line by making sure your looping for everything aside from sulfuric acid is fine. As always, show your final products to the mainnet, but now that we have trinium and nequadria coming through, it's time to move on to another project to let our materials build up. The next thing we need to complete for the research station now is nuclear fission. Fission is actually a pretty decent source of power around this tier in progression that only really needs to be fed thorium dust, but fusion plasma is just around the corner, so I'll be ignoring this as a power source for this run. Instead, the only reason I'm setting up this here is so that we can get plutonium-241 to make fusion reactor controllers. Fission processing is pretty simple, and I'm just doing a closed subnet here for this, but all we need for this line is a nuclear reactor, a canner, a centrifuge, a couple batteries, and a couple stacks of thorium. It's pretty much as simple as setting interfaces on these, but after you dump the thorium in, it should go through the canner, then to the fission reactor to get depleted, then to the centrifuge, and then repeat the process with the dust from that one more time for plutonium-241. If you're wondering what I'm doing with the power from this, since the fission reactor will stop if the dynamo hatches are full, I'm just dumping it into a gargantuan flux storage on its own network. You could just as well trash this though if you're just wanting it for a bit of plutonium. You might have to wait a bit for it to process, but once you have a couple plutonium-241, you can go through and pattern the casings and controllers you'll need to make fusion reactors. Really, you don't need that many fusions until you unlock the Mark III, so I'm just going to be building 4 of these, but the main thing we need to get out of these for now is europium. There's also duranium and a helium plasma recipe, but we won't really be needing any of those until we have Mark IIs, so all we need to do is make sure we have hydrogen and neodymium in stock so we can produce europium. I'm just using requesters to keep these in stock, but the neodymium by itself is starting to stress our single block extractors now because of this, so I figured it was time to set up some parallel extractor multi-blocks. Didn't really take long, but I threw a quad down right here in front of our reactors to handle that bottleneck. Back to the reactors though, I have a double subnet system set up that is totally unnecessary for the time being since we only need one material out of these right now, but I saw this really cool system created by Django that I wanted to try out for myself here. At this point in recording, I haven't quite figured it out well enough to explain it yet, and I feel like the setup deserves its own guide, so I'll have to make a separate video for this soon. Before we move on, one last fun fact about these reactors is that they have an interesting bug where they just animate every block that has animations within a radius, including other fusion controllers, causing this nonsense you see here. I'm sure this allows for some pretty cool decorations for those of you that might be a bit more creative than me, but I wasn't really sure what to do with this, so I'm just going to be stacking my donuts like normal and going on about my business. With europium accessible to us, we can make ZPM machine parts and crystal circuits now. This part is mostly just setting patterns and assigning them to machines, but the crystal chips to make these circuits are seriously pretty cheap, so by all means produce a ton of these. They craft pretty quick and loop at a 1:9 ratio, so I don't think there's much of a reason to make a dedicated passive setup for these, but do as you please with them as long as you don't consume all of your europium with it. These crystal circuits will go up to UV tier for us, but the UV ones need to be made in assembly lines, which will require research data that can only be done in the research station. Since our fusions have had some time to run and build up europium, we'll finally have what we need to craft the controller, object holder, and HPCAs for these. Of course, there's more patterns to make, but I'm going to get these crafted and set up. Research stations, for those of you that aren't familiar with them, are pretty much the same as the scanner, but more complicated, I guess. In order to do research with one, we'll have to connect them to high-power computation assemblies that provide computational work units, or CWU. The HPCAs have different component parts that will either provide CWU or cooling, but we're going to need to balance these so that we don't fry our HPCA parts. If I could, I would go straight for the exact amount of CWU production that I would need to complete the pack, but the progression with these is a bit tiered off, so we'll have to slave through that first. Initially, the best we can do is one HPCA with 4 basic computation components for 16 CWU per tick. But after we do a bit of research, we can unlock the advanced components and we can get a max of 48 CWU. I made some extra controllers for later, but if you're wondering why you can't just cheat the system and set up multiple HPCAs to get all the CWU you need, it's because these use fiber optic cables that don't split, and the only way to split the connection is with a databank. Easy enough until you realize that the databank costs trinium, which will require us to set up Mark II fusion reactors. Rough, but no sense in complaining when you can be gregging. The next step here, now that we have access to pretty much everything in ZPM, is to set up those Mark II fusion reactors. As always, this will take some patterns and a little bit of waiting on crafts, but I'll be back once I have what I need to set these up. Alright, so I have some Mark IIs set up now, and all I need to do is hook these up to AE2. Once again, I only made 4 of these, and I'm still saving on casings with the maximum number of hatches here, but hooking AE2 into all of these hatches is kind of visually irritating, even if it is hidden inside the reactors. Along with unlocking new recipes, these reactors will do Mark I recipes twice as fast as our old reactors. Fusions have their own overclocking that just uses twice the power for twice the speed instead of the standard 4 times the power, so it's kinda like half a perfect overclock, but it's a neat feature they have. The main thing we'll be needing out of these reactors for this tier is tritanium, so prioritize that, but you'll also be needing a decent bit of duranium, americium, and some europium, so keep those in stock too. For these, we'll be needing to keep quite the list of liquids in stock, so good thing we made extractors for this. But for those that don't want to find the full list for themselves, we'll be needing lanthanum, silicone, chromium, titanium, gallium, and radon. The radon is probably the worst of these to keep up with, especially later on once Mark III fusions are up, so really do your best to make sure your radon supply will manage. Most people just scale up distillation towers for this, but from my experience, that method is rough on TPS, and even at ridiculous levels of overclocking, it's just not that profitable on radon, so instead I recommend using a passive plutonium looping system. All you'll need to feed it is uranium-238, which can be done with the uraninite refinement steps here, and as for the plutonium you'll need to loop, you can initially obtain it by sending uranium-235 through the nuclear fission steps to get it. The loop itself only requires an LCR and a multi-smelter to pull off, and the uraninite refinement only needs another LCR, a centrifuge, and an electrolyzer, so neither of these should be too hard for you to do on your own. You could just ignore me and scale distillation if that's the way you want to go, but I figured I would mention this loop around the same time we are doing fusions because it's pretty useful. There isn't really much else I can say around fusions for now, but when I get around to the subnetting guide for these, I'll make sure to link it in the description. That's really all I had to say for today though, since we actually went a bit further and faster than I expected on this episode. Thanks for watching to the end, and feel free to leave any questions about today's projects in the comments below. As always, hope to see you on the next one. Ciao!